Welcome to Celeb Scene Central. On the heels of last week's episode, House of the Dragon Season 2 takes a somewhat more subdued step back, seemingly to let both us, as well as the characters, mourn the show's most significant loss yet in Rhaenys, Eve Best, and her dragon Malaise, but also to afford both story and audience alike some breathing room. In the brutal aftermath of the Battle of Rook's Rest, both the Greens and the Blacks have sustained casualties. While Aegon, Tom Glencarny, and his dragon Sunfire did survive being dracarised by Aemond, Ewan Mitchell, and his dragon Vhagar, the king's life is currently hanging by a thread, which leaves a spot open at the head of the table for someone to assume authority. As episode 5 illustrates with harsh clarity, particularly where Alicent, Olivia Cook, is concerned, sometimes the biggest power grabs don't come from your enemies but the people who are positioned much closer. The Greens rally behind a new leader in House of the Dragon Season 2, Episode 5. At King's Landing, Criston Cole's, Fabian Frankel, army is supposedly making its triumphant return after Rook's Rest, parading Malaise head through the streets and touting Aegon as responsible for vanquishing the traitorous dragon. If such a showing was meant to inspire joy and renewed faith in the people, however, it does anything but. At least one person from the crowd remarks on it being a black omen, a terrible harbinger of what's to come, while another voice points out that Rhaenyra, Emma Darcy, will likely have an answer for this abomination. As for Aegon himself, however, the gravely wounded king is quietly shuttled through the city and into the Red Keep in a covered box, without ceremony, so that none of the small folk can bear witness to the true scope of his injuries while they're distracted by the more public display of Malaise's head. As Grand Maester Orwyle, Kurdi Jayawan, observes in his initial assessment of Aegon's wounds, there are burns that seem to cover a majority of the king's body, in addition to the numerous broken bones he sustained when he and Sunfire plunged to the ground. Right now, Aegon is hovering on the precipice between life and death, and it's anyone's guess whether he'll conquer the latter. Unless you happen to be one of the people who have read Fire and Blood and know how this will all turn out, but we're in firm no-book spoiler territory here. In the meantime, however, as Aemond observes, someone will have to be appointed to rule in his stead, and the question of who that someone will be hangs over most of the episode. Alicent seems increasingly uneasy around her younger son, especially now that she's noticed him wearing Aegon's catspaw dagger, and seeks Criston out directly to ask him about Aemond's part in all this. Whether the Hand of the King knows the truth or is as in the dark as many others is unclear, but his loyalty to Alicent also only seems to run so deep. When the small council convenes, Alicent is the one to put the idea of a regent on the table, initially suggesting herself for the position since she held a similar one when Viserys, Paddy Considine, was in his final years. Yet the rest of the council balks at the idea of a woman serving as regent, particularly in a time of war. The obvious choice, one points out, is the king's immediate successor, Aemond. While Alicent doesn't outwardly accuse her son of having a hand in his brother's current state, she does push back at the idea, instead directly referencing Aemond's age and lack of restraint. But as she looks around the table, very few seem willing to meet her gaze. Orwyle attempts to argue in her favor, but he's overridden by everyone else. Larys, Matthew Needham, Tyland Lannister, Jefferson Hall, and Jasper Wilde, Paul Kennedy, are all backing Aemond. Even Criston, who has remained silent up until this point, doesn't take Alicent's side, voting in favor of her son. As Aemond assumes a new seat at the head of the table, in the king's seat, Alicent finally seems to come to the conclusion that her voice in this room is truly gone, especially once Aemond declares that no one in King's Landing will be allowed to leave, and the gates should be barred immediately. Later, when Alicent confronts Criston about his decision to go against her, all that the Hand witnessed at Rook's Rest is now confirmation that they have officially given this war to the dragons, so it should be a dragon rider who leads them. The Blacks scramble for better positioning in House of the Dragon Season 2, Episode 5. It's difficult to mourn during war, but even more difficult when you seem to be the only one doing so. When the episode opens with Corlys, Steve Toussaint, and Rhaenyra each having a private moment to remember Rhaenys, it seems to be the show pointing out that this is as long as they'll be afforded to grieve before having to get back to it. For Rhaenyra, this means dealing with a small council who levies misogynistic remarks at her that are anything but subtle, referring to demons, Matt Smith, absence from Dragonstone as the consequence of a marital spat, among other things. Ser Alfred Broom, Jaime Kenna, is arguably the most vocal among them, and his impertinence and unwillingness to defer to Rhaenyra seem to mostly stem from his belief that women are not as suited to the business of war as men. As Rhaenyra observes, however, they have had peace all this time. Alfred has seen no more war himself, so attempting to argue about who's more qualified is a pointless endeavor. One of the clear parallels between Rhaenyra and Alicent in this week's episode is the fact that they have both been fighting to keep their voice in their small council meetings up until now, but where Alicent finds herself swallowed up, talked around, and ignored, left to wallow in her own humiliation, Rhaenyra forces her way back into the conversation, reasserting herself and her authority while demanding answers that her advisors can't necessarily give. It also doesn't help that her closest allies, with the exception of Corlys, who she seeks to name her hand, and Mysaria, Sonoya Mizuno, are made up of either men who second-guess her every decision or children who are barely adults themselves. Jace, Harry Collett, even takes it upon himself to go and do some negotiating on Rhaenyra's behalf without running it by her first. Initially, his intention is to fly to Harrenhal and find out what's going on with Daemon, but then Jace decides to meet with House Frey, since they control a critical passage in the Riverlands through the twins. With access there, Rhaenyra would no longer need to wait for Daemon to secure things now that more of her allies are marching south. While Baela, Bethany Antonia, doesn't inform Rhaenyra of Jace's plan until after he's already departed, it turns out that Jace is actually pretty good at negotiating, although he's also making promises, like giving the Freys control of Harrenhal, that he might not be able to keep. As for Daemon, he's been better. Between failing to earn a surrender from the Brackens, even under threat of death by dragonfire, and having dreams about becoming intimately entangled with a mysterious woman, Emmeline Lambert, who turns out to be his mother Alyssa, Episode 5 emphasizes that he really needs to get it together from a tactical as well as a headspace standpoint. To make matters worse, he discovers that Harrenhal only has enough gold to barely keep the fires going, thanks to Larys transferring most of the family funds to King's Landing after his father and brother died in Season 1. Sir Simon Strong, Simon Russell Beale, suggests Daemon reach out to Rhaenyra to provide the coin they need, an idea that Daemon instantly shuts down out of sheer stubbornness, before insisting that he'll do the crowdfunding himself. At Rhaenyra's side, one could argue that Daemon was perfectly suited to the role of lieutenant, and he certainly has experience fighting battles, but on his own, he's never been more rudderless, strutting around and insisting that everyone refer to him as a king. It's something that doesn't escape the attention of the witchy Alice Rivers, Gale Rankin, who bullies him into accepting a bandage for his hand when he overdoes it on the rebuilding efforts in Harrenhal. When she questions whether Daemon's strategy has been Rhaenyra approved, that's the moment when we get the first honest look at how Daemon feels about all of this, as well as his ultimate plan. When I take King's Landing, Rhaenyra is welcome to join me there and take her place by my side. Rhaenyra, however, has her own strategy this week, asking Ser Alfred to go to Harrenhal and ascertain Daemon's intentions since he keeps ignoring her ravens. The timing couldn't be more urgent, especially since the Riverlords have shown up at Harrenhal in the dead of night and are pissed with Daemon for sicking the Blackwoods on the Brackens after their initial refusal to surrender. Apparently, the Blackwoods took it a step way too far in some instances, ransacking sacred places and murdering innocents, all while carrying Rhaenyra's red and black banners. It seems that Rhaenyra's biggest PR problem isn't anything having to do with her decision-making, but Daemon himself. Although Rook's Rest was one of the bloodiest battles in the Dance of the Dragons to date, it might be something much more innocuous and unexpected that has the potential to topple Rhaenyra's enemies. As Mysaria reminds Rhaenyra, the power of the small folk shouldn't be underestimated, and later on, we see the Queen's loyal lady-in-waiting Elinda, Jordan Stevens, sneaking into King's Landing to meet with none other than Diana, Maddie Evans, the servant girl whom Aegon sexually assaulted during the events of the first season. Between the brewing discontent among the small folk and the ill omen that Malay's head signifies, not to mention Aemon's decision to shut the city gates, Rhaenyra might have thousands of people willing to fight in her name from within the very walls of King's Landing itself if the right words continue to spread. Beyond that, as Rhaenyra and Jace realize they have 2 more dragons to deploy, the question becomes, who is left with the blood of old Valyria left in their veins to potentially ride them?